So I see some new faces. A bunch of y'all were in Joe, but I do see some new faces. So just a couple of things to mention before we get started. On your computer, you can just hover over your own image, and in the upper right hand, excuse me, in the upper right hand, you can unmute yourself. There's a little button you can press. So if you want to speak at any time throughout, feel free to interrupt me, but know that towards the end, well, I should say midway through the class, we will have a point for discussion and questions and reflection. But I don't want you to feel like you need to wait till then if you have something pressing you want to ask. The only other thing I wanted to mention is unrelated to this class. In regards to the death of George Floyd and the protest happening across the country, the church is starting a race and faith discussion group, and that's going to meet 4 times. You might have seen that it came out in the newsletter on, I guess that newsletter came out yesterday. So this group will read through the book. The Cross and the Lynching Tree by the Black theologian James Cone. We'll read through that, but we'll also look through contemporary accounts and experiences of Black Americans speaking about different things. And so it'll be looking through the book, but also reading articles. If you're interested in being a part of that, just email me. It's 4 meetings over about 8 weeks. So we're meeting every other Thursday evening. If you want to get on that list, just email me at will@palmacia.org, and I'll include you to that list, and I'll send out the reading list soon. I do have a PDF copy. Well, it's an online copy of The Cross and the Lynching Tree. It's a great book. If you don't have it, it's an important book in American theology, but especially so in Black theology. And I invite you to buy a copy, but if you don't want to, I will send out a link to a free copy of that. So we are starting our Genesis Bible study. And unlike the Job Bible study, we are not going to read Genesis in its entirety. I would recommend, if you have the time, to read the book in its entirety. I've sent you a syllabus that has the readings for each week. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to follow the Old Testament lectionary readings for each Sunday. So it will jump around a lot. We will miss a lot, but that's just how it goes. And if you do have the time, I would highly recommend kind of reading in between the readings, because things will make much more sense and you'll have a greater context for everything. If you can't, that's completely fine. Just if you can, try to read beforehand. And as I've mentioned before, I don't like little passages. I don't think it gives us a context, and that's what the lectionary gives us. There's a reason they do that, and I understand it. But what we'll typically do is read the chapter in its entirety. So if it's like, chapter 18 verses 12 through 33, we're just going to look at chapter 18, because that'll give us much more of a context. We'll study those verses, but I just find it so important that we can kind of wrestle with the text. Now, Genesis is obviously the first book in all of Scripture. It's the first book in the Hebrew Bible, and it's the first book in the Christian Bible. What's really important to note before we get going is it is not the first book written. There are texts much older than Genesis. Now, a lot of these stories were told orally, and so we don't know the exact date as to when they appeared. But as far as textually, when they were written down and kind of considered important by the community, Genesis is not the oldest of those. There's some other texts that kind of predate it, but Genesis is important in a way that's hard to ascribe to other texts because of its primary position in the Bible. And I want you to start thinking about Genesis as we read it in the context of the passages, but also in the context of Scripture as a whole story, right? We have the Bible presented to us today as a collection of books. When these first came out, they weren't part of the Bible. They were these kind of separate texts, and they were eventually put together by the community, deemed holy, deemed inspired, deemed important, deemed authoritative. And in that process, there was a discernment that Genesis should go first. And I know some of you are thinking, well, of course it should go first. It has a creation story in it. but there's plenty other creation stories throughout Scripture. We always point to Genesis 1 and 2 as the first kind of creation stories, but there are other creation stories. Isaiah has a creation story. Job has the kind of creation story of chapters 38 through 41 about God speaking about how the world was put together and all the animals that inhabit it. It's not in the sense that we think of creation in the context of Genesis, but they are creation stories. So in that context, thinking of, well, there's other accounts of creation or God as creator. Why are these the ones that made it to the front? Why are these the ones that start our Bible? Another question to think about is, what is this saying about God, and what is it saying about us as humans, as God's creation? And the last part I want you to think about is responsibility. So there's a relationship entailed between God and creation, between God and humankind. What does that relationship entail as far as responsibility? I think that's such an important point. You can think about responsibility in the terms of faith, right? We have, as beings of faith, we don't just sit around, right? We are responsible to act out our faith. And so faith in Genesis is very much about, what does it look like to live rightly with God, with God's creation, and with God's people? What does right relationship look like? I think a lot of times we think of faith in this kind of dogmatic sense. Oh, I believe this, I believe that, and therefore I am a Christian. And I think what we see throughout Genesis is that this is a narrative, this is a story. And that story is theological, but you cannot separate the theological from the narrative. And that narrative entails action and living it out. And so what does a relationship look like lived out in the world? And I want to say responsibility is a good way to think about that. There's a freedom of that responsibility, right? We aren't forced or coerced into this relationship. God gives us the freedom to act how we want in the world, right? Think about Cain and Abel. That's a freedom there that goes kind of in the wrong direction. So those are some things that I'm thinking about as we enter into this text. I really want to highlight relationship, though, because I think that is the central point, and that's why this class is called Creation and Covenant, right? Covenant is the kind of way we talk about the relationship with God and God's people. So let's get into the text. I want to break this up because it is a longer text. So Marcia Ryberg, if you could be our first reader and read 1 through 13. You're muted.
I have to warn you a little bit. I have something called the Jewish Study Bible that I was using, and it is
completely fine.
Christian Bible.
Yep, I'm familiar with it. It doesn't matter what version you have. Feel free to read it. That's completely fine. I understand we're not in class, so we're not all having the same Bible. Excuse me.
13, right?
Yes, and then if Allison Kelly. All right. If you'll read 14 through 23. And then I'm going to ask John Wells if he'll read 24 through 31. And I'll just read the end, which is just the first 4 verses of chapter 2. Okay. Marcia, ready when you are.
Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was unformed and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning one day. God said, "Let there be a dome in the middle of the water. Let it divide the water from the water." God made the dome and divided the water under the dome from the water above the dome. That is how it was. and God called the dome sky. So there was evening and there was morning, a second day. God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." And that is how it was. God called the dry land earth, the gathering together of the water he called seas, and God saw that it was good. God said, "Let the earth put forth grass seed, producing plants, and fruit trees, each yielding its own kind of seed-bearing fruit on the earth." And that is how it was. The earth brought forth grass, plants, each yielding its own kind of seed, and trees, each producing its own kind of seed-bearing fruit. And God saw it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, a third day.
God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will mark events, sacred seasons, days, and years. They will be lights in the dome of the sky to shine on the earth." And that's what happened. God made the stars and two great lights, the larger light to rule over the day and the smaller light to rule over the night. God put them in the dome of the sky to shine on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw how good it was. There was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. Is there more?
Yeah, the 2023, please.
God said, "Let the waters swarm with living things, and let birds fly above the earth in the dome of the sky." God created the great sea animals and all the tiny living things that swarm in the waters, each according to its kind, and all the winged birds, each according to its kind. God saw how good it was. Then God blessed them. "Be fertile and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." There was evening and there was morning on the fifth day.
And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day.
Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this is a very familiar story. I think this is a story most Westerners are familiar with, even if they're not Christian or Jewish. It's it's just part of our culture, right? This story, the 7 days of creation. Most folks can kind of give you a rough account, maybe not a day-by-day account, but an account of what's going on in this story. I want to walk us through the text and point out a couple things specific to verses, and then kind of broaden it out and talk about some broader points. Feel free to interrupt me, but in a couple of minutes, I'll transition over to y'all and see what questions and thoughts y'all have. When was this written? By most accounts, based off of the language, the vocabulary used, scholars date it to around 550 BC. That would have been when the Israelite people were in Babylonian exile. And a lot of people point to this story showing an ordering out of chaos. God there's this kind of formless void, and God is bringing order to it. And that order is important to a people that have essentially had their whole identity uprooted. Not only geographically have they been uprooted, but kind of their culture, their religion, all of their social norms, everything has been completely turned upside down. And so in the telling of a creation story in that particular time, not only was it important to talk about order and the structuring of the world, but it shows that God is ultimately in charge, not the Babylonians and not the Babylonians' gods, but rather the God of Israel, Yahweh. And so this is when the story, for however long it was told orally, this is when the story finally came to be written down, that was put into kind of a text. So I wonder if you show me by a show of hands, how many of y'all's verse 1 starts with "in the beginning"? Just raise your hand if it says "in the beginning." Okay, so when we hear "in the beginning," we automatically think, okay, there is a beginning. But the Hebrew reads, when God began to create the earth. So it's not as much of a temporal at this point in time, but rather when God began to create. That's not a huge difference, but it does make a distinction, because it's not saying in the beginning, it's saying rather when God began to create. And so we don't know what happened before then. Maybe nothing happened, maybe something did, but that's an important distinction. There's also this beautiful, the word in Hebrew in verse 2 is tohu vavohu, and it's often translated as formless void, but it's this sense that there was this kind of, I don't know, there's this kind of void, emptiness. There was something there and it was formless, right? Robert Alter translates it as welter and waste. The point being is that God is coming and ordering something that is disordered. The Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo states that God creates out of nothing, and this story doesn't line up with that. There is something, even if it is kind of formless and void, there is something there. So I always tell people, when you think about the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, the point isn't that this lines up accurately with the story of Genesis, but rather that God is God alone, and that there is no kind of co-eternal matter with God. That's the important point to make there, right? That God is God alone, that God didn't start with other things around God. That might not line up exactly with the creation story, but this is a story. It is not a theological doctrine, right? The story that we have in Genesis, that's important to remember. This is a story that was told by people and it was passed on. Walter Brueggemann makes the point that Genesis is not a scientific or historic document, and it's not a mythological document. It is a theological proclamation. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because we've heard plenty of people say that this is a historical document, that the world was created in 6 days, that creation is 6,000 years old, da, 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 da. That's not what this is. When this was written, there wasn't a concept of history in that sense. No one was trying to write a history of the world. They were writing a story about who they were in relationship to God and who God was. And so in that sense, this is a theological proclamation. This is a story telling us something about God. That's really important to keep in context. And I can't stress enough that this is a narrative. We cannot separate the theological meaning from how the story is told. That's really important, because a lot of times we want to pull out the theology and we just leave a lifeless narrative. The beauty of this is that the theology is told through story. That's why it has such a lasting power and is so important to so many people. So there's this order that happens throughout the days. God is creating. You could hear when everyone spoke, right? This kind of repetitiveness around the days, right? God said, "Let there be," and there was. And God saw that it was good. And then there was evening, and there was morning the first day, and that kind of follows this pattern. So there's a pattern going on. I'll talk in a little bit about what's happening each day, but I just want to point out that there is a structure within the days and a structure to the entire creation story. So each of the days is happening. I'm going to share with you right now a screen. So if you have your handout, I shared this table at the bottom of the notes. Can everyone see that on your screen? So you're seeing here, right? There's day one, God, Vahet Haaretz, Vahet Hashemayim, the heaven and earth, the light and the dark. And then day two is this what's called, like, typically referred to as the atmosphere. It's separating the waters from the waters. So in the ancient kind of cosmology, there was waters over the earth. And why would there be waters over the earth? Because it rains all the time. And so what the kind of cosmology here is that there was a kind of sphere that separated the waters above from the waters below. And so I just refer to that as atmosphere, but you know, the Hebrew, the scripture reads separating waters from waters. On day three, there's dry land and plants. Day four are all the lights in the sky, in the dome of the sky. So the stars, the moon, the sun. Day five are birds and sea creatures. And then day six, you have land animals and humankind. And day seven is rest. It's really important the way I've laid this out, and I don't know if you can pick up on this or not, but there is a structure and a parallelism going on here. So I've put the first 3 days in a column and the second set of 3 days in a column, and then obviously what we call the Sabbath, the rest days, at the bottom. So I want you to look here. Day one, light and dark. Day four, stars, moon and sun. Day two, atmosphere, which is the sky that separates the waters from the waters. Day five, birds and sea creatures. Day three, dry lands and plants. Day six, land animals and humankind. What's going on here is there's a parallel between these days. The light and the dark is where the stars, the moon, and the sun are. The atmosphere, which separates the sky from the ocean, is where the birds and sea creatures are. And the dry land and plants is where the land animals and humankind live, as well as what they eat. And so there's a structure to this. This seems kind of simplistic to us, right? A lot of y'all have read accounts of the Big Bang or other theories of how the world was formed. They're extremely detailed and there's a lot of stuff going on. This can seem almost kind of silly. God did this, God did that. But it's really important to think that there's a lot of thought in here. There's an extremely considerate amount of order and structuring, and the text is paralleling itself. And that paralleling is so important because God is thinking ahead. God is creating with an intentionality. This isn't just like, oh, I'm going to throw out some birds here, and then tomorrow, I'm going to cast some plants down. This is thoughtful, it's considerate, and it's intentional. And that's very important to think about creation, not as some chaotic act, but rather as God's concern and thoughtfulness towards creation. That thoughtfulness is so important because God is sustaining creation as well as creating it, right? And part of that sustenance is that we have plants to eat. That's so important. This isn't a God that creates and walks away. This is a God that creates, and continues to create, which sustains humankind. I want to point out something. This text is often said that humans are the apex of creation, that God created humankind as a kind of the final act of creation. The final act of creation, the apex of creation, is the Sabbath, is rest. Now, it's not called the Sabbath here. That word's not used until Deuteronomy and Exodus. But that idea of the seventh day for rest, for holiness, when God looked over everything, which God declared good, that is the apex of creation. Another point to that is, if you look in verse 28, it said God blessed them. God blessed humankind. But go look at verse 22. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas and let birds multiply on the earth. So God's speaking to the birds and the sea monsters here. That this act of blessing and a command to be fruitful and multiply is not given to humans alone. I'm not trying to negate the importance of humans here. I'm just trying to kind of level things out, because for a long time this text has been humans, 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 and it's really important to note the complexity of this chapter, of this creation story. There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of intentionality in the language being used. So we do get to humans on day 6, and humans are important. I want you to look at verse 27. Listen to the amount of times that the word created is used. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. That kind of redundancy of created is important. It's pointing out that there's something important here. God speaks to them, not just commanding them to be fruitful and multiply, but in verse 29, God says, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. God is speaking to humankind here, which is important. And as we know, we've all read Genesis to some extent. God has a continued relationship with humankind that is different than all the rest of creation. So I want you to kind of hold those two things in your mind, right? Humanity is not the apex of creation, but humanity is important and has a specific role in all of creation. One other kind of textual point I wanted to make about this is a couple of words. Some of y'all have probably heard me talk about this, but I think it's so important because there is almost a millennium of misuse of these words. So the first is in verse 26. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. That word dominion, I could go on and on about that word and how it's been misused for the exploitation of creation. This word has been held up over and over again, not only in English-speaking countries, but in others, as God has given us the right to completely do whatever we want to creation. And if that's not enough, go to verse 28. God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So not only do we have permission to have dominion, but we can subdue as well, right? Those words have a kind of almost violent connotation to them. I don't think any of you are trying to subdue or dominate your children or your spouse, right? Those aren't things you would want someone to do to you. And the kind of violence that is within them, and I'm not using violence in this kind of go around and hurting people, but more just the kind of sense that when we hear those words, there's a kind of almost a negative reaction to them. it's really important to consider the Hebrew here. And so dominion is a Hebrew word, radah. And what radah, the way I would translate it, is kingly responsibility. Whenever you see this throughout the Old Testament, it's used, I think, 27 times. It's spoken in the sense of a responsibility. And it's important twofold. The first is that responsibility is always given from God. It's not something inherent to humanity, but rather that God has given this responsibility. And the second is it is a responsibility. It is not an outright thing where you can just go out and do whatever you want. It's not tyranny, but rather it's a responsibility. There are cases in Scripture, I think in Genesis and Exodus, where that radah, that dominion, is taken back by God, excuse me, because it wasn't exercised correctly. And the word subdue, I think, would better be translated as cultivate. The whole point of it is to subdue in a way that brings life. So it's not to subdue as to kind of beat down or hurt or just use for whatever purposes you have, but rather to use it in a way that brings more life than there already was. So you can think, I always use the example of a garden. If you have a garden, you have to subdue the weeds. And why do you subdue the weeds? So that your plants, your vegetables, or your flowers have more life. So the whole point of subdue is to bring more life. Now, this isn't me being a tree hugger trying to get you all on the train to care for creation. This is what God is saying to the first inhabitants of earth. You have a responsibility to cultivate this world in a way that brings life. And that is so important in the way we act towards creation, but also how we how we act towards other people. All of our relationships, all of our interactions, whether they are with creation or with humanity, should be done about in a way that brings life, that brings abundance. Scripture speaks over and over again that we should have abundant life, right? But that abundant life is a life that we are responsible to bring about in a way. And so that's the tension here, right? There is a burden placed upon us that's not placed upon any animal, and that is that you have a responsibility towards creation, but it is also one that we have a choice in. We have a freedom to choose whether we bring about abundance or we don't bring about abundance. And so I really want you to think about that. That's how this story starts. And that's so important. And I want you to think about that relationship and that responsibility, right? God cares about creation. God deems it good. The material world is not bad. God wants us to enjoy life in the material world. It is a good thing, but we have a responsibility towards it to bring about more life. Excuse me. A quick note on the word image. When it says, let us make humankind in our image, this is used in the way not of like a visual image, but like a 3D, something like a statue or something. And so I don't know what that means. I think that's something for us to wrestle with and talk about, but I want you to think about, what does it mean to be made in God's image? There's a scholar I reference in your notes who speaks about attributive and relational, or excuse me, substantive. I think it's substantive. Look at me, I'm talking and I don't even know what I'm saying. Substantive and relational image. So substantive would be like we carry the characteristics of God. So we are upright, we are moral, we care for other people. And relationship means, rather, instead of those specific attributes, it's how we orient ourselves to other people. Are we peaceful? Are we in a community that cares and is compassionate, or one that is mean and vicious towards the other? And so this scholar says, image is much more about relation than specific attributes were given. That doesn't mean that attributes aren't important or aren't God-given, but rather the primacy, the primary point here is relational. And so think about that in this sense. What is God calling us to be in relationship with God? and how are we reflecting that in relationship with other people? I want to just say one more quick thing. Fundamentalists read the gospel as, read the creation story as a literal account that God created the earth in 6 days, that this is exactly how it happened. And I think most of us might scoff at that, saying, well, this isn't how creation happened. We know that. But there is also the other side that wants to say, well, science said there was a big bang and that creation happened in one kind of, and the creation story mimics the Big Bang. There's countless books by theologians that will point and laugh at fundamentalists, but then they do the same thing from a different perspective and say, well, this mimics the Big Bang account. This isn't a scientific document. I can't say that enough times. For the fundamentalist and for the people that want to talk about Big Bang, that's not what this is concerned with. This is a story about theological relationship, about who God is and what our relationship to God is. I don't think this is literal, but at the same time, I'm not going to say this mimics the Big Bang account. I just think that's going off in a completely wrong direction. I'm reading a good amount of books, and I've read a ton on Genesis, and there are too many to number that always want to point out, well, this is like Big Bang. And I just think that's you're missing the point. This is proclamation about who we are, who God is, and what God is calling us to. Okay, enough from me. I want to open it up now for thoughts y'all have about Genesis or this particular chapter, questions you have or reflections you want to share with the class. Just unmute yourself or raise your hand, and Aaron and I will find you and unmute you. Okay, I'm going to go with Marcia and then Dave.
My little book, Bible translation that I read out has a footnote on Genesis 1:1, which is similar to what you were saying. And it says, before time began, which is kind of you made me start thinking about that, in that it shows the pre-existing eternal nature of God. And maybe one of the things he created that's not specifically referenced in here is time. And that's echoed in the morning and the evening. But so when you think of it as God was out there and then he starts time, the clock turns on. That's sort of, that was helpful to me.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, we think about how we mark the time just kind of intuitively, right? By the morning and the sun coming up and the night and the sun going down. And there's that kind of repetitiveness that you pointed out. Dave?
My Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, has an interesting note here on the fourth day. I'm wondering if all the other translations have the same characteristic, and that is, the term is, and so it was, God made two great lights. And the comment is that their names are omitted deliberately. The sun and moon were worshipped by neighboring peoples, and here they are treated as no more than lamps to light the earth and regulate the calendar. Are all the translations, did they admit the name sun and moon?
Yeah, I know the NRSV just says lights. I'm looking what Robert Alter translates it. If anyone else wants to speak up, feel free.
Mine has lights.
Yeah, I think most of them say lights. Yeah, Alter does as well. Yeah, that's an important point that you bring up. The creation story, the first one, is very similar to the other creation stories, in that there's a consistency of how the days compare, but there are extremely important distinctions made throughout the story. And so Dave's pointing out, one, that the sun and moon aren't lifted up because there's not this sense of animism. There's not this sense that the different heavenly beings, the lights, the stars, the moon, the sun, are not divine or godly in any sense. They are just lights in the sky. And so that's an important one. Another one is that God not only kind of controls the chaos, but brings order out of the chaos and declares it good. So while there are similarities between the stories, there are important differences. The monotheistic one is a kind of at the forefront, though. Thanks, Dave. Who else has questions, thoughts, reflections? Okay, I see Betsy. Go ahead.
You were mentioning, the concept of dominion and submission, and it's referred to in the Message using the terms of responsibility. I'll just read 26 to 28. God spoke, "Let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature, so they can be responsible for the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the cattle, and yes, earth itself, and every animal that moves on the face of the earth." God created human beings. He created them godlike, reflecting God's nature. He created them male and female. God blessed them. Prosper, reproduce, fill the earth, take charge. Take charge instead of whatever that other word was. I know it was submission or whatever. Be responsible for fish in the sea and birds in the air, for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth.
And were you asking a question or just pointing out the translation?
I was just reiterating that the concepts you talked about as far as dominion and I guess taking advantage or thinking that we're the pinnacle of creation, that just reinforces in my mind what you were saying.
Yeah, that's a helpful translation there of dominion and subdue. Thanks for sharing that. There's an article I'd be happy to share. It has plenty of issues, but it was written in the 70s. That was kind of the precipitating factor for Christians to review how they related to creation. The article is very kind of condemning of Christians as being responsible for ecological degradation. And they point specifically, the article does, to those words, because those words have given us this sense that essentially we've replaced God and we can do whatever we want. And that's not what those words say. Those words say, you're responsible towards creation and you should do it in a way that brings flourishing. So translations like yours, Betsy, are so helpful to hear.
Well, it seems to me that this image of himself relates back to what we saw in the book of Job, where Job was representing perfect goodness. And I think what God is saying, what's happening here is when God says he's creating man in an image of himself, he's putting perfection into the world. He's putting an ideal goal of intentionality into the world. The rest of the world doesn't have any intention, doesn't have any goodness, whatever. God is concentrated in man. That's how he has dominion. Dominion, in a general sense, is the world with the Satan. And again, going back to Job, what's happening with Job is the world's events are raining down on Job, and his goal is to personify goodness and ask for justice. So that's where God has given us dominion over the world. Our job in the world is to constantly seek justice.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that's why I keep to the point of just I feel like I'm banging you over the head with a hammer talking about relationship. And I think that's what justice looks like, is right relationship. God models that right relationship, and we are called to kind of mirror it, not only with ourselves, but with creation. If you look at Psalm 104, that's another account of creation, and it talks about the beauty of creation and God's sustenance of creation and God's providential care for creation. And the only thing it mentions that is bad is the wicked human at the very end. And I think that's a really good point, that creation is not bad in itself. The only one that has the potential to be bad is humankind, because we have that freedom to act justly or act unjustly. And the onus of responsibility is upon us to act justly, to bring life that flourishes and is abundant in our relationships and our relationship with creation. Thanks, Dave. Sybil.
It always strikes me when I read this that in verses 29 and 30, he talks about that we're given the green plants and fruits and all of those things, and even the animals will only eat vegetation. And so there's no death of any of the flesh and blood creation. So I always think about that.
Yeah, so that's something that folks throughout history have laid out for reasons for them being a vegetarian, and that goes back to the early Jewish readers of the book up into the present day. The time where we begin to eat meat, according to the primeval history of Genesis, is because God wants to assuage our violence, essentially, around the time of the flood. And so the act of eating meat is essentially to kind of contain or control our violence. So there's an interesting case here to be made for vegetarianism, which if we want to follow the Bible to the T, it means you got to stop eating meat, I guess. But I'll let y'all determine that. Thanks, Sybil. Everyone's like, let's hurry up and read the flood so we can get to eating meat. Nicole.
Nicole, you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. I think
There
I
you
did
go.
it. Why do you think they use the plural in verse 26? Let us make man in our image after our likeness.
So that is something that has long been wondered over. Christians will say, well, it was the Trinity, but the Trinity is a doctrine that Christians, came up with hundreds of years later. And so scholars have wrestled with this, and there's two things that they come down to. The word used for God throughout, now there's different words for God, but one of them is Elohim, and Elohim is a plural, but it's used in a singular sense. So even if it says Elohim, it typically has a plural verb to go with it, verb form to go with it. And so what most scholars settle upon is this is the heavenly council. So if you were in Job, so you remember at the beginning of Job in the prologue, there's this kind of heavenly council, and that's where the accuser is. And it's kind of like all the beings and angels that are with God. There's no real way to kind of know what this is referring to, because it just says in verse 26, then God said, let us make humankind in our image. I think that the heavenly council is the easiest way to explain that God had angels and other beings around God, and that's who God is speaking to. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have like a specific answer there, but that's kind of what scholars have settled on.
Sounds good.
Thanks. Ed?
Yes. I was startled by that diagram that you showed. Was that in our handout someplace? I didn't come across it.
Yes, it was. I put it at the bottom of the notes.
Okay. Well,
It's not in the syllabus. It's in the one that was sent out this morning.
oh, okay. Well,
That's where you got confused.
But that type of a table is kind of the way I organize my own study of things, which is kind of interesting. But I think there could be another column added to that table, and I hesitate to drop this immature thought, but entailed with this column, in the third column, are a number of other things that are introduced that help explain how we think and who we are and how we deal with creation. And one of the things that is introduced, well, not necessarily there, but later on, naming, which means that if you have names to things, you have a standard for transmission of data, because it will identify what you're thinking about somebody else. Now that's an important tool. I don't know whether animals have that or not, but we do, and to an exquisite degree. Another thing that they mentioned the masses. Well, this entails bringing gravity. Now, people in those days didn't think, oh, I've got gravity, and they also didn't think I've got air to breathe, and a whole lot of other things like that, that they, like a fish doesn't know what it's like to be out of water. We don't know what it is like to be out of air, except that it wasn't there to begin with. And it was a part of an explanation of what we have. There's the two lights, which I don't know that they distinguish between the two, but one of them provides energy. Now, energy is necessary for the whole rest of the thing, including life, because as you learn in high school physics, it takes energy to reduce entropy, which is a word for disorder. And we're talking about creating order out of disorder. As a predecessor, and then finally, the idea that time is linear is not really the way we perceive time. It certainly doesn't look linear as you get older. We perceive it in more of a logarithmic phrase, but we measure it in a linear way. As I say, that's an immature thought that just left my mind when I saw the diagram, but that may be the end of it. But those are some side messages that I think are embedded in the story.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. I see you, Marcia. I think one of the really important things for us to do as we read through this is to think through how are we reading this differently from those who first read it, and the countless generations before us, but also how are we reading it the same? Because in many ways, the message, the meaning of the text is the same. And so hearing you talk about all the ways you're thinking through this text and the meaning of it reminded me of that. Thanks, Ed. Marcia? Oh, but you need to unmute yourself.
This translation has a whole note on Elohim, and I thought, I'm going back to the former comment, and I thought maybe a little bit of this might be helpful if you want. It says Elohim is the most common of the names of God, used 32 times in the first chapter of Genesis alone, and 2,500 times in the Tanakh. That's the Old Testament, isn't it?
Knock. Yeah.
It is plural in form, though is commonly construed with a singular verb or adjective. Probably this is explained as the plural of majesty or excellence, expressing high dignity or greatness. The ancient name for God conveys the idea of his creative power, authority, and sovereignty. The singular Eloah is relatively rare, occurring only in poetry and late prose, 41 times in Job. It's used in 6 places for heathen deities, etc., etc. So basically, it's saying that even though it's a plural verb, that's the main name for God in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's why I was referring to. It's typically it's plural in form, but it's typically used as a singular, and so that doesn't really explain the verse 26 that Nicole was asking about, and that's why typically people go to heavenly counsel. Thanks, Marcia. Is there any other questions, thoughts, reflections?
Well, it seemed to me that Ed brought up some extremely important points about naming things. These things that God created were basically created when he named them. There was something unnamed, and he then called it the void or the universe or whatever, and all of a sudden it pops into existence. And then the next day something happens. And as Ed pointed out as well, these changes now set in motion time. So you start moving forward from nothing to existence. And God then marches on through his 7 days. So I think Ed had a number of extremely important points about the fundamental ideas here in this story.
Yeah, the word speak is used 14 times in this chapter, and the word, it depends, the translations are different, but there's a Hebrew word for create, bara, and a Hebrew word for make, and make's used like 5 times, and I think bara is only used 3 in verse 27. But I might be getting that off. But the point being is that create and make are used less than the word speak, and so God is speaking creation into being, and that is obviously as Christians something we think about with Logos in the prologue of John, the Gospel of John, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the importance of the Word, and what does the Word signify? And so that's another thing to kind of think through how we read this and how that compares to earlier readers of this. And as Christians, it's really important to think through this in the context of John 1. So that's a text you could go and read and think through.
Another comment about the naming. God himself is sort of the prime mover here. And going back to scientific ideas again, when you have a sufficiently interesting system, as we do in the world, you need to have some undefined terms. And as we learned in Job, God is undefined. He's beyond human understanding. So here's a name, God, that we don't know what it is. We don't understand it. We think it's goodness personified, but that's about all we know about it.
Thanks, Dave. So it's 11 o'clock, and I want to just before we close, I want us to think through one thing as we continue reading through Genesis. The first section is so cosmic, and I think our mind ultimately jumps to scientific explanations or understandings of what's going on. I cannot reiterate enough that this is not a scientific text. This is a text about theology, and it's proclaiming who God is, who we are, and our relationship to God. And so as we read through this will become clearer and clearer because we get into who are called the patriarchs, right? Like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And those characters have an intimate relationship with God, and in that sense, it's easier for us to understand. But in this cosmic tale, don't just jump to thinking through time and gravity. Those are important things, and I'm not saying they're not, but think through the theological message here. What is the meaning that this text is telling us? And ultimately, what are the spiritual ramifications of that? I personally want to push this idea of responsibility. As humans, as Dave was saying earlier, we have a responsibility towards justice or just relationship. And so think about this in a spiritual context as well. I'm going to pull up. I have a prayer I created for this class a while ago, and I'd like for us to just share in it. Let me pull this up, and we can just end with this, and we'll end with this each week. So it's just a little benediction, and there we go. If you'll just join me in reading this. Let us go from this place, remembering God's words to Jacob. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Let us go from this place, proclaiming Jacob's words. Surely the Lord is in this place. Amen. Thank y'all so much for joining. Feel free to go through your notes again, because I don't typically cover everything, and there's some questions in there for reflection. Thank you for all your comments, thoughts, and I'll see you next week.